Most respected scientific bodies continue to issue ever more urgent warnings about humans changing the Earth's climate. Yet, often it seems those warnings are brushed off or ignored by those with the power to take action. The ABC's National Science and Environment reporter Michael Slezak and producer Penny Timms walk us through the most recent of those reports and the reaction they've received.
Now to a dire warning about climate change.
Cars and homes were washed away.
If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
Warnings of impending climate disasters. Growing in urgency.
Heavenly Father, please help us.
Last month, the US government produced a landmark report on climate change and its impacts.
The 1,600-page report painting a dire picture if nothing is done.
It says Earth's climate is now changing faster than at any point in the history of modern civilization. Climate change is already causing injuries, illnesses and death in the US and will endanger virtually every sector of the US economy.
We are now seeing much firmer or much more definitive language being used in the reports, and some of that language is starting to really be quite shocking.
Global temperatures have already risen by 1 degree Celsius, causing more frequent droughts and intense floods and fires. Carl Braganza is head of climate monitoring at the Federal Bureau of Meteorology.
Interesting to see, because
He says the language in the US report is brutal for a reason.
Look, it's really reflecting the reality of the science, and I think as the impacts start to become more tangible, it's really bringing home some of the more worst-case scenarios associated with climate change.
Greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are the only factors that can account for the observed warming over the last century. There are no credible alternative human or natural explanations. But President Donald Trump isn't convinced by it.
I don't believe it. No, I don't believe it.
Today's landmark report should leave you in no doubt about the links between extreme weather and climate change.
The UN panel says governments around the world must take rapid action to curb rising temperatures.
In October, the world's chief climate body, the IPCC, examined the difference for the world between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees. It says that before a baby born today turns 50, the world is set to warm by 2 degrees. The IPCC says the world hasn't been that hot for at least 129,000 years, roughly since modern humans left Africa.
Many of your listeners will hear about records being broken. Most of those records are extreme heat records. They shouldn't be being broken as often as they are.
Watch out, buddy.
Capping global warming at 1.5 degrees would help about 10 million people avoid the impact of sea level rise.
We've told you the scientific facts, the evidence, the costs. It is up to the governments now to decide what to do with it.
Despite this, the climate change debate continues in the public domain, with some denying that greenhouse gases are changing the climate. Those who reject the scientific consensus say either that natural phenomena, like changed volcanic activity, are causing the warming, or they say that temperature records are falsified by authorities. Shortly after the release of the US and global reports, the UN released its own emissions gap report. It provided a damning assessment of Australia's progress towards its promised emissions cut. The Federal Environment Department has long provided frank advice to politicians that the country's existing policies won't be enough to make that cut. This is what Australia has promised it will do: cut emissions to 26% below 2005 levels by 2030. But the Federal Department says this is where emissions will go.
We're going to meet those in a canter, our 26% target.
Climate warnings have been coming for decades, initially about a distant future.
Even now, man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
One model of climate, the Jason climate model, predicts that doubling carbon dioxide will result in August in Washington, D.C. that are 9 degrees centigrade warmer, or 16 degrees Fahrenheit, than current summers.
By 1938, rising global temperatures were scientifically linked to the burning of fossil fuels. Today, experts say the science is settled.
The evidence that the changes we're seeing occurring in temperature and other meteorological and climatological variables is caused by CO2 is unequivocal. It's absolutely certain.
Certainly in Australia, when we look at extreme heat events, so record-breaking spring heat waves, for example, we see a fingerprint of human-induced warming on those events.
This Exxon platforms.
In the 1970s and 80s, the companies causing the most warming did their own studies into what was happening. Despite being no good for business, in 1982, global oil giant Exxon predicted future warming. Perhaps incredibly, those 36-year-old predictions are in line with what's being seen today.
In 1988, a confidential Shell report warned that any remaining doubt shouldn't be used to delay action, since the implications for the world are so large. But the industry moved quickly to discourage politicians from acting on their findings.
It's essential to life. We breathe it out. Plants breathe it in.
And lobby groups funded by the fossil fuel industry campaigned against what they called climate alarmism.
Carbon dioxide. They call it pollution. We call it life.
The science is warning us of dire consequences if we don't wean ourselves off carbon, but politicians are not enabling industry and communities to wean themselves off the carbon, and therefore we're heading towards some of the consequences the climate scientists were warning us about.
Michael Slezak reporting.